My life was a study in misery, utterly shattered when fever stole my husband and my son on the trail. Left with nothing but crushing grief and unwelcome freedom, I was completely adrift. Salvation arrived when a desperate, kind rancher needed a wet nurse for his failing infant, and through that unexpected duty, everything changed. Chapter 1. The Trail of Ash. The sun was a malevolent god out here, vast and indifferent, hammering the prairie with heat so solid it felt like a sheet of brass. It was high noon on the Kansas-bound trail, and the light leached every color from the world, leaving only the bleached white of the sky and the endless aching tan of the dust. Grace Mallory leaned against the side of their covered wagon, the smallest, shabbiest one in the train, and tried to draw a clean breath. The air tasted of fine grit, mule sweat, and the faint, curdled sourness of fear. She shifted her weight, feeling the familiar, grinding exhaustion deep in her bones, and adjusted the small bundle in her arms. Her son Thomas was fussy. He was 5 months old and too thin, his little face flushed red under the muslin bonnet she'd sewn. His cry was a weak, reedy sound, a tiny protest against a world that had offered him nothing but discomfort since his birth. Grace bounced him gently, whispering the only lullaby she knew, a tune her own mother used to hum, its melody simple and sorrowful. "Hush now, Thomas. Just a little further, my sweet boy." Just a little further. The wagon train ahead was moving at a maddeningly slow pace. 24 wagons, creaking and lumbering, kicking up great, choking clouds of silt. Grace's throat felt perpetually dry. She hadn't had a proper drink of water since breakfast, and the tin canteen was rattling empty, a painful reminder of her husband's constant vigilance. A shadow fell over her, not of a cloud but of a man. Eli Carter came around the back of the wagon, wiping his hands on trousers that were permanently stained with tobacco juice and grime. He was a shiftless man, long and stringy, with a permanent scowl carved around his thin mouth. He didn't look at Grace, he looked at the baby. "That noise," he ground out, his voice low and dangerous, "is drawing flies. Can't you make him quiet?" Grace's stomach tightened, a familiar clench of pure dread. She knew the rules. Keep silent, keep the baby quiet, and never, ever disagree. She rocked Thomas a little harder. "I'm trying, Eli. He's thirsty, I think." "We're out of water." Eli's eyes finally flickered to her, cold and resentful. "You think?" he mocked, a sneer twisting his lips. "You think, Grace? A woman like you has no need for thinking. I told you to make sure the canteen was filled at the last creek. Now the boy's fussing, and we're held up. We've been moving for hours," she countered softly, her voice barely a whisper. "I didn't want to bother the others, and the creek was mud when we passed it. It's always an excuse with you." He reached out, his hand catching the collar of her worn calico dress. The motion was quick, sharp, and intended only to assert his dominance. It wasn't a hard pull, but it was enough to make her stumble slightly, enough to send a fresh wave of heat to her face. "Your mothering is thin, Grace. Just like your education. Just like your spine. We left your father's failing farm to better ourselves, and you're doing nothing but slowing us down. If you'd been a better wife, maybe the boy wouldn't be so weak." The accusation was a blunt instrument. It wasn't the first time he'd suggested that Thomas's fragility, and indeed, their entire miserable lot, was her fault. Grace held the baby tighter, shielding Thomas with her body, and just nodded. She looked down at the dust, swirling around her worn boots. "I'll be quiet, Eli. I'll make him quiet," he snorted, finally releasing her dress. "You do that. I'm going up to talk to Mr. Harrison about this pacing. Don't move from this wagon, and if I hear that sound again, I'll be back." He turned and strode away, his departure leaving a palpable void in the already heavy air. Grace didn't dare cry. She had learned long ago that tears were just fuel for Eli's resentment. Instead, she retreated into the stifling, dim interior of the wagon. She sat on the hard mattress, the scent of mildew and old wool heavy around her, and pulled the bodice of her dress aside. She offered Thomas her breast. He latched on weakly, sucking in small, ineffective bursts. Even in the shade of the canvas, the heat was suffocating. She watched him, her heart aching with a familiar, complex mix of love and guilt. She had married Eli not for love, but for a roof. Her father had been a shiftless drinker, the farm a graveyard of lost hopes. When Eli, loud and boastful, offered her marriage and a way out, she had snatched it up, trading one cage for another. She only realized how small the new cage was when it was too late. Thomas had been her reprieve, the single, blinding joy in a life of quiet despair. He was her reason to endure. If she could just get him through this journey, to a new place, a new beginning, maybe then she could find a way to breathe. She was uneducated and soft-spoken, but underneath the timidity, there was a seam of iron will, forged by necessity. She would protect this child, A sharp, rattling cough from outside interrupted her thoughts. It was a hacking sound, deep in the chest, unlike the shallow coughs of dust irritation. It came from the wagon immediately in front of theirs, the one belonging to the O'Malley family. Grace listened, a chill running down her spine despite the heat. That sounded like sickness. Real sickness. The next few days blurred into a nightmare. The sickness, which the wagon master quickly but quietly identified as cholera, moved through the train like a scythe. It didn't respect property, position, or health. It struck the young, the old, the stout, and the frail. The first to fall was the O'Malley patriarch, dead within 48 hours. The train didn't stop, but the silence did. The casual, joking camaraderie of the trail was replaced by a grim, fearful quiet. Every cough was a terror, every ache a death sentence. People stopped sharing water dippers and started eyeing each other with suspicion. Eli, ever self-absorbed, became paranoid. He barked orders at Grace to clean every surface with vinegar, which was scarce, and forbade her from speaking to anyone outside their wagon. "It's filth that kills people, Grace," he lectured, pacing nervously. "And lazy women. Don't touch a soul. Don't let that boy near anyone." He was terrified of dying, not because of what he'd leave behind, but because of what he'd lose. His own miserable life. The day the fever found them, it didn't choose a single target. It struck with ruthless efficiency, a double blow that broke Grace's world in two. It started with Thomas. On a Tuesday evening, as the sun was bleeding red into the horizon, Grace felt the heat radiating off his tiny body. Not the gentle warmth of sleep, but the dry, searing heat of fever. His labored breathing was shallow, his small chest rattling. His cries became weak moans. Grace panicked, her carefully constructed wall of endurance crumbling. She held him tightly, pressing her cool cheek to his hot forehead. "No, no, my love, please," she pleaded, rocking back and forth. Eli, sprawled out on the floor of the wagon, clutching his gut with a sudden, agonizing cramp, didn't even look up. The noise! Shut him up, woman! But soon, his own moans joined the baby's. Eli's illness was swift and brutal. Within hours, he was racked by severe cramps and fever, his face gray. Grace, numb with the terror of watching her son fade, ministered to Eli mechanically, fetching the little quinine they had, mixing weak broths. She barely registered his presence. Her focus was entirely on Thomas, on the desperate, failing fight for his life. She spent the entire night huddled in the corner, holding Thomas, his small fingers occasionally flexing against her dress. She spoke to him constantly, pouring out all the love she had held back, and all the hope she had pinned on him. "You'll be a good man, Thomas. You'll be kind. We'll have a little house, and I'll teach you to count stars. Oh, please, God, let him count stars." But by dawn, the sweet, reedy sound of his breathing faded to nothing. His body went slack in her arms, his small face peaceful, the fever finally gone. Grace made no sound. No scream tore from her throat, no tears burst from her eyes. The grief was too vast, too enormous to be released. It simply hollowed her out. She stared at the child she had loved more than life itself, his weight light and lifeless, and felt nothing but cold disbelief. She sat there, frozen, the rising sun casting a pale, indifferent light through the back of the wagon, until Eli began to scream. He was in an agony of cramps, demanding water, demanding a doctor, demanding Grace. "Water! Where are you, Grace? You useless woman! Don't let me die!" She looked down at the pale, still face of her son, and then across at the twisted, terrified face of her husband. In that moment, the exhaustion of years of abuse, poverty, and now, this devastating loss, calcified into an unnatural stillness. She set Thomas gently on the mattress, pulled a clean cloth over his face, and walked out of the wagon. She found a bucket of lukewarm water and a tin cup. She went back inside and offered it to Eli. "Here," she said, her voice flat, devoid of emotion. He snatched the cup, gulping greedily. He was too consumed by his own pain to notice the absolute emptiness in her eyes. Eli Carter lasted another 2 days. His illness was characterized by loud, self-pitying demands and terrible accusations aimed at Grace. He blamed her for not being clean enough, for bringing bad air into the wagon, for everything but the actual disease. Grace responded with a terrifying surgical efficiency. She fed him, changed his soiled bedding, and gave him medicine when she could. She was a nurse to a man she detested, but she was operating on instinct, a machine fueled by shock. She kept busy because to stop would be to face the overwhelming reality of the silent bundle beside her. When Eli finally died, in the middle of the night, his breathing simply stopping with a gasping, final rattle, Grace was there. She didn't touch him. She didn't cry. She went to the back of the wagon, sat beside Thomas, and waited for the morning. The sun rose on a world suddenly stripped of all her anchors. The wagon master, a man named Mr. Harrison, came to her wagon with 2 older men, their faces etched with fatigue and pity. "Mrs. Carter," Mr. Harrison said gently, resting his hand on the wagon canvas. "I'm sorry. We've lost 3 others overnight. The ground is too hard to dig deep." They buried Eli and Thomas together, side by side, on a rise overlooking the dusty trail. It was a hasty, brief ceremony. The Reverend Pike, his collar wilting under the heat, said a short prayer about the harsh hand of God. Grace stood by the fresh mounds of earth, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white. She watched the dirt fall, covering her cruel husband and her innocent child, and felt a stunning, perverse realization. She was entirely, unequivocally free, and she was entirely, unequivocally alone. The wagon train could not stop. The fear of contagion was too great, the need to press on too urgent. Mr. Harrison approached Grace again, his face troubled. "Mrs. Carter, we can't take you further. It's too dangerous. We don't know if the sickness is still in your things. And you have no one to drive." Grace nodded slowly. She didn't argue. She didn't care. "We're stopping at Ash Hollow this afternoon," he continued, pointing toward a faint cluster of dark shapes on the horizon. "It's a half-built town. You can find work there. We've put together a collection for you." He pressed a small, heavy sack of coins into her hand, $30 or $40, an unbelievable sum. Then, he looked at the small, tattered bundle of Eli's belongings and the few dresses she had. "Take what you can carry, Grace. We have to leave the wagon here. It's too large, too much of a risk." She walked back to the wagon that had been her prison and her sanctuary. She collected her small Bible, her spare shift, a tin cup, a blanket, and the sack of money. She looked at the wooden chest where Eli kept his papers and felt a sudden, fierce urge. She rummaged through it quickly, found a tattered piece of paper, a debt note or a land claim, she didn't know what, and tore it into tiny pieces. The physical act of destroying something that belonged to him was the only defiance she had ever allowed herself. Her eyes fell on Thomas's worn flannel blanket. She picked it up, pressed it to her face, and finally, a single, hot tear tracked a path through the dust on her cheek. It was the only acknowledgement of her loss she was capable of. When she stepped out of the wagon, she was carrying a small satchel, Thomas's blanket, and the coins. She didn't look back at the wagon. She didn't look back at the graves. She simply started walking towards Ash Hollow. She was left behind in a small, half-built town on the frontier, given a few coins and her husband's tattered belongings. Ash Hollow was less a town and more a collection of ambitious splinters. A dozen structures stood along a single muddy road: a saloon, a general store, a blacksmith, and a ramshackle building that was half church, half schoolhouse. Grace arrived just as the wagon train pulled out, leaving her standing alone in a swirl of dust and silence. The town felt less hostile than the empty prairie, but more watchful. The few people gathered outside the general store, mostly men, weather-beaten and curious, turned to stare at the lone woman, dressed in mourning black, with no wagon, no escort, and no child. Grace pulled Thomas's blanket tighter around her shoulders, less for warmth than for the illusion of comfort. The guilt was starting to creep into the numb space the shock had left. Guilt that she hadn't fought harder for Thomas. Guilt that a wicked, shiftless man had died, and she felt only the smallest, blackest curl of relief. She walked to the general store, her boots sinking slightly into the mud. The man behind the counter, a plump, sweating man with a friendly mustache, eyed her with cautious pity. "Can I help you, ma'am? I need a place to stay," Grace said, her voice dry and unused. "I was with the train. They left me." "Cholera, was it?" he asked, already knowing the answer. She simply nodded. "I need work. I can cook. I can clean." He shook his head slowly. "We got no room at the boarding house, and the ladies here, they do their own cooking. You best talk to Mrs. Hanlon. She's the widow who lives on the edge of town, near the South Spring. She sometimes takes in strays." He pointed a thick thumb toward the south road. "Be careful, though. Men out here don't take kindly to a woman alone." Grace murmured her thanks and left the store. The walk to Mrs. Hanlon's was short, leading her past the settlement's few buildings. As she passed the small church, she saw a man with a stern face and a clerical collar, Reverend Pike, talking in low, intense tones to a woman with a sharp nose and an even sharper look in her eyes. Their conversation stopped dead when Grace passed. She could feel their eyes on her back, burning with a mixture of suspicion and moral judgment. A woman alone. The store owner's words echoed in her mind. On the frontier, a woman without a man was not simply unprotected. She was suspect. A temptation, a responsibility, or an outright trouble. Mrs. Hanlon's cabin was small but neat, sitting beside a little grove of cottonwoods. When Grace knocked hesitantly, the door opened to reveal an older woman with a round, kind face and eyes that held the deep wisdom of a life lived hard and well. "Yes, child?" Mrs. Hanlon asked, her voice soft but firm. Grace repeated her rehearsed speech. "My name is Grace Mallory. I was left by the wagon train. My husband and son, they passed. I have a little money, but I need a cot, and I need work. I'll clean, cook, anything." Mrs. Hanlon's gaze softened instantly. She looked Grace up and down, taking in the worn dress, the fine layer of trail dust, and the devastating emptiness in her eyes. She saw not a risk, but a fellow survivor. "Come in, dear," she said, stepping aside. "The Lord provides, but sometimes he needs a little help from neighbors. You look like you haven't had a proper meal in weeks." Inside the cabin, it was clean, smelling faintly of baking bread and soap. Mrs. Hanlon immediately sat Grace down at a small table and put a plate of beans and salt pork in front of her. "Eat. Then we talk." Grace ate, slowly at first, then with a fierce hunger that surprised her. The food tasted like life, and for the first time since the fever started, she felt a flicker of the primal instinct to survive. Later, sitting on a simple cot in a back room, Grace spoke softly, telling Mrs. Hanlon a sanitized version of her story. The illness, the loss, the necessity of being left behind. She omitted the cruelty of Eli and the bitter relief that now coexisted with her crippling grief. Mrs. Hanlon listened patiently, occasionally patting Grace's hand. "You have a good, strong spirit under all that sorrow, child. The frontier has a way of stripping away what's useless and finding the true metal beneath. You'll be fine." "But the work," Grace whispered, her eyes filling with a helpless exhaustion. "Mr. Thompson said there was none." "Work is here," Mrs. Hanlon assured her. "But not for a salary, not yet. You can help me wash laundry for the few men in town, the bachelor foreman at the lumber yard, the boys at the blacksmith. We'll charge them fair, and you'll keep a share. It's hard work, but honest, and when the right kind of job comes along, I'll know." For the next 2 weeks, Grace worked with a silent, ferocious intensity. She scrubbed shirts and boiled bedding, her hands raw from the lye soap. She cooked Mrs. Hanlon's simple meals. The physical labor was a dulling balm for her raw grief and isolation. Every sore muscle was a distraction from the guilt that threatened to overwhelm her when she was still. She was slowly regaining her strength, but her spirit remained brittle. She often found herself staring at Thomas's blanket, tucked neatly on the foot of her cot, feeling the vast, echoing emptiness of the frontier mirroring the void in her heart. Then, one Thursday afternoon, just as the sun was beginning to dip, a horse thundered up to Mrs. Hanlon's cabin, pulling up short with a spray of gravel. The rider dismounted with an economy of motion that spoke of long hours in the saddle. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered, dressed in clean but worn denim and a heavy canvas coat. His face was weathered, handsome in a rugged, uncompromising way, but his expression was a mask of sheer exhaustion and something colder, resentment. He looked like a man who was used to managing everything, suddenly confronted by a problem he couldn't solve with rope or muscle. He didn't bother with pleasantries. He strode to the door and knocked hard. Mrs. Hanlon opened it. The man didn't look at her. His gaze was fixed on some point over her shoulder. "Mrs. Hanlon," he began, his voice deep, curt, and rough-hewn. "I'm Jack Avery. My ranch is 8 miles north of here. I'm told you know every woman in this town." "I know a few," Mrs. Hanlon replied calmly, folding her hands over her apron. "I need a woman," Jack stated flatly, running a weary hand through his dark hair. "My wife passed 2 months ago. Died in childbirth. The boy—" He stopped, a flicker of pain crossing his face, instantly masked by a stoic wall. "The baby's failing. He's 2 months old, and he's not taking the milk. I've tried everything. Every goat, every bottle. I need a woman who can wet nurse him." He looked desperately around the room, finally catching Grace, who had frozen by the kitchen sink, her hands dripping lye water. He didn't see a woman. He saw a solution to a logistical nightmare. "I need someone immediate, competent, and quiet. I'll pay. Whatever it costs." Grace stood utterly still, the sound of the tin cup rattling as it slipped from her paralyzed fingers and hit the basin. The sound echoed loud in the sudden, shocked silence of the cabin. Jack Avery had just ridden into her life, and the trail of her grief was about to intersect with the burden of his. Chapter 2. The Unnatural Arrangement. The tin cup hit the basin with a sharp, resonant clang that seemed to shatter the thick, exhausted air in Mrs. Hanlon's kitchen. Grace remained frozen, her hands suspended above the greasy dishwater, the lye stinging her raw skin. She could feel the full weight of the rancher's stare, an impersonal, assessing look that settled on her with a distinct lack of pity. He didn't see Grace Mallory, the grieving widow haunted by guilt. He saw a solution. Mrs. Hanlon, ever the diplomat, cleared her throat. "Mr. Avery. This is Grace Mallory. She was left here by the wagon train after her family succumbed to the fever. She's strong and a very hard worker." Jack Avery finally let his intense gaze meet Grace's eyes, and she felt a chilling certainty that he found her lacking. She was thin, dressed in faded black, and her hands were rough from manual labor. But his need was evidently greater than his fastidiousness. "A widow," Jack stated, the word carrying a mix of confirmation and suspicion. "You have recently had a child, then?" The question was a direct hit to the place Grace was trying hardest to seal off. She swallowed, the bitter taste of unshed tears rising in her throat. She looked down at Thomas's flannel blanket, which lay draped over the chair near the stove. "Yes, sir," Grace managed, her voice a dry rasp. "My son passed a fortnight ago." The fever, a flicker of something, recognition, perhaps shared loss, crossed Jack's face, but it was quickly banished, replaced by the granite stoicism she'd first observed. "I'm sorry for your loss, ma'am. But I'm in desperate straits. My boy Samuel is failing. 2 months old, and he's nothing but bone and fuss. We've tried every wet nurse between here and Fort Kearney, and they've either run off or dried up. I can offer you steady pay, a clean room, and a legitimate need. You'd be caring for the boy and keeping the house. The ranch is quiet. You'd be away from the town, away from the gossip." He made it sound like a job description, a practical transaction devoid of emotion. But Grace's internal landscape was anything but practical. She still produced milk. Her body, in its cruel, lingering connection to her dead child, still performed the function of a mother. To accept this offer was to take the gift meant for Thomas and offer it to a stranger. It felt like betrayal, a horrifying, sickening act of substitution. She would be feeding a life while her own son lay in a dusty, unmarked grave. Mrs. Hanlon saw the profound distress in Grace's eyes. She put a warm, supportive hand on Grace's back. "It's a shock, dear, a terrible thing to be asked," Mrs. Hanlon said, looking at Jack with a gentle warning. Then she turned back to Grace, her voice soft and persuasive. "But look at it another way, Grace. God took Thomas to his bosom, but he left you with a gift, a way to save another innocent soul, the grieving mother's milk, given to the living. It's a divine purpose, child, a chance for your sorrow to nourish hope." Mrs. Hanlon's interpretation, that this was an act of sacred duty, not betrayal, was the only thing that pierced Grace's grief-induced paralysis. Her deep capacity to nurture, the core of her being that Eli had tried so hard to stamp out, began to stir. Thomas was gone, but a new baby, weak and failing, needed her. She lifted her chin, meeting Jack Avery's impatient eyes. "I will do it, Mr. Avery," Grace said, her voice trembling slightly but firm. "For the boy. I'll come on 2 conditions. I won't take the full wage until I know I can save him, and I am to be treated with respect. My name is Grace, and I will not be shouted at." Jack looked surprised by the quiet steel in her voice. He gave a sharp, single nod. "Agreed, Mrs. Mallory. I am a man of my word. We leave at first light." The journey to the Avery Ranch, a simple but sturdy collection of structures known as the Hollow, was undertaken in near silence. Grace sat on the hard bench of Jack's spring wagon, Thomas's blanket folded tightly on her lap. Jack drove with fierce concentration, his gaze fixed on the horizon, only occasionally flicking a look at the small basket on the seat between them. Inside the basket lay Samuel Avery. He was a pitiful sight. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and he was disturbingly still, not exhibiting the plump resistance of a thriving infant. His cry, when it came, was a tiny, mewling sound of profound exhaustion. Grace found herself reaching out tentatively, her fingers tracing the softness of his cheek. The movement was involuntary, motherly. Samuel turned his face toward her touch, a reflexive seeking. Jack noticed. "He won't take a bottle, ma'am. Don't waste your strength." "I wasn't trying to feed him, Mr. Avery," Grace replied softly, pulling her hand back. "I was just assuring him he's not alone." Jack didn't reply, but his jaw tightened. Grace recognized the look. It was the face of a man resenting his own vulnerability, struggling with guilt for the loss of his wife and the need to hire a stranger to save his son. When they arrived, the hollow felt cold and still. The main ranch house was large but utterly devoid of warmth. It was clean. Jack clearly kept a meticulous, masculine order, but it lacked the soft clutter of domesticity. It was a place for sleeping and eating, not living. Not living. "The room next to the kitchen is yours," Jack instructed, leading her inside. "The boy's cradle is in the master bedroom, where it's warmest. We'll establish the routine immediately." The routine was brutally simple. Survival. Grace took Samuel into the small, clean room Jack had assigned her. She set the cradle close to the cot and knelt down. She gently unswaddled the frail infant. His ribs were visible, his tummy sunken. Her heart broke. Not for Thomas, not entirely, but for the profound, universal tragedy of a child struggling to live. The guilt overtaking this act of nurturing was still there, a knot in her stomach, but it was overshadowed by the immediate life-or-death need. She sat on her cot, pulled Samuel close, and offered him the breast. The first few attempts were agonizing. Samuel was too weak, too frustrated by the battle to feed. Grace was patient, speaking to him in low, soothing murmurs, the very same words she had whispered to Thomas. "Easy now, little bird. You have to be strong. Mommy is here." And then, with a desperate, tiny gasp, he latched. The sensation was sharp, painful, and overwhelmingly cathartic. It was a physical release of the profound ache of loss, channeled instantly into the creation of new life. As Samuel sucked weakly but persistently, Grace closed her eyes. She felt the tears well up, finally, not of utter desolation, but of gentle, productive sorrow. When he finally fell into a milky sleep, his small hand curled against her chest, Grace felt the tension in her own body ease for the first time in months. She was still grieving, but now her hands had a purpose. The weeks that followed settled into a pattern of quiet, awkward proximity. The ranch became a theater of forced domesticity. Jack Avery remained curt and distant, referring to Grace only as ma'am, or occasionally Mrs. Mallory. Their communication revolved entirely around the logistics of the house and the baby's health. "The boys slept 4 hours," Grace would report over the morning coffee, her eyes still heavy with lack of sleep. "Good. Tell me if you need more coal," Jack would reply, not meeting her eyes, before heading out to the fields. He was a man consumed by work. From dawn until dark, he was on his land, fixing fences, tending cattle, building. He was stoic and hard-working, and his emotional guard was always up. Grace focused entirely on her dual role, wet nurse and housekeeper. She brought order to the ranch. She cleaned the house until the windows sparkled, patched Jack's worn shirts, and started a small garden patch outside the kitchen where nothing had grown before. She cooked simple, nutritious meals, stewed chicken, cornbread, and fresh sourdough. Jack's home, built on loss and maintained by grim duty, began to soften under her care. The change was slow, subtle, and profound, but the real transformation was in Samuel. With Grace's consistent, gentle nursing, he began to thrive. His cries became louder, stronger. His pale skin began to gain a healthy flush. When Grace smiled at him, he would sometimes give a wobbly, reflexive smile back. It was this bond with the baby that began to chip away at Jack's armor. One evening, Jack returned late, dusty and exhausted. He found Grace sitting in a rocker by the hearth, Samuel asleep in her arms. The baby was chubby now, curled comfortably against her chest. Jack stopped just inside the doorway. He stood there for a long moment, watching. The firelight cast warm shadows on Grace's face, catching the shine of relief in her eyes as she looked down at the child. She looked serene, a natural Madonna. Grace finally noticed him and started slightly. She stood to put Samuel in his cradle. "Mr. Avery. You're late. I'll keep your supper warm. Leave it," he said, his voice unusually low. He walked over to the cradle. He looked down at Samuel, not with the weary resentment of the first day, but with a hesitant, almost fearful tenderness. He reached out a hand, hovering over the baby's cheek, then pulled it back as if burned. "He's better," Jack finally stated, his voice thick with unexpressed relief. "He's got color. He's thriving, Mr. Avery," Grace confirmed, her own heart swelling with pride and a bittersweet ache. "He'll be sitting up soon enough. He just needed consistency." Jack finally looked at her, truly looked at her. "I owe you a debt, Mrs. Mallory. Not just the wages. You've saved my son. I wasn't sure I could do it alone." It was the most he had ever said about his vulnerability. The confession was a tiny crack in the stoic facade, and Grace felt a sudden rush of empathy for this lonely, guilt-ridden man. "You've lost much, Mr. Avery," she responded quietly. "Grief is a heavy weight, and it's not right to expect a father alone to be a mother too." He didn't thank her. He didn't offer comfort. He simply nodded and walked away to the barn, needing to return to the simple, manageable tasks of his ranching life. Meanwhile, the gossip of Ash Hollow began to travel the 8 miles to the hollow. The ranch was isolated, but the flow of necessary supplies, flour, sugar, coal, meant that Jack had to go into town, and he brought the judgment back with him. The local lawman, Sheriff Cooper, was the first to voice concern, though with fair intent. One day, Jack returned from town, slamming the door shut with unusual force. He tossed his hat onto the table. "Sheriff Cooper cornered me," Jack reported, his jaw tight. "He says folks are talking about the arrangement. A man and a woman alone, on an isolated ranch. He asked if I'd lost my mind, bringing a stranger in." Grace stopped her churning of butter. "What did you tell him, Mr. Avery?" "I told him to mind his own business and that you were hired to save the child, nothing more. He's fair, but he's watchful. He said he'll be riding out this way more often. He said it looks improper." Grace felt the familiar heat of shame rise in her cheeks. The freedom she had found after Eli's death was contingent on her good reputation, and now that was being soiled. She was caught between gratitude for a safe roof and the paralyzing fear of public judgment. "I won't cause you trouble, Mr. Avery," Grace said, clutching her apron. "If I am compromising your standing, I can leave. I'll take what little money I've earned and find a new town." Jack turned, his eyes flashing with a sudden, rare anger. "No. You will not leave. The boy needs you. I hired you to do a job, and you're doing it better than anyone could have imagined. I won't let the wagging tongues of a few idle women force you back to a sod house. You have saved Samuel's life, and my house is a fortress against them. You stay." His command, for the first time, felt less like ownership, like Eli, and more like protection. Grace found herself not trembling with fear, but feeling a small, surprising thrill of being defended. As the weeks turned into months, a subtle, almost imperceptible warmth began to infuse the house. The shared chores became a silent language. Jack started leaving the best cuts of meat for Grace's cooking. Grace started leaving his supper plate covered with a clean towel, a fresh slice of pie beside it. He noticed the tiny flower border she'd planted. She noticed the meticulous care he took with his tools. One evening, Grace was trying to mend a tear in one of Jack's saddle blankets. The thread kept tangling. Jack walked into the kitchen, smelling of leather and cold air. He stopped, watching her frustrated effort. "Here," he said, surprising her. He pulled up a stool. "Give me that needle." He took the needle and thread, and with rough, large hands that were surprisingly steady, he demonstrated a sturdy saddle stitch. "My mother taught me, a good stitch should hold a man's weight." Grace watched, mesmerized by the focused precision of his hands. "I should know how to do that," she murmured. "I know only how to patch things until they fall apart." "That's the difference between ranching and surviving, ma'am," Jack said, handing the blanket back. "Out here, everything is done to last." It was a small moment, but it felt like a turning point. It was the first time they had shared a non-essential skill, the first time awkward silence turned into subtle warmth. Jack began to notice Grace's quiet strength, her resilience, her patience with Samuel, the gentle way she handled the animals when she fed the chickens. He saw a woman who was uneducated but deeply intelligent, who had faced down tragedy and chose to nurture life anyway. Grace, in turn, began to see past the stoic exterior. She saw the moments he would secretly watch Samuel with a look of profound, yearning love. She saw the guilt in his eyes, the belief that he had somehow caused the death of his wife by being an inadequate husband. She saw his deep, honorable core, the reason he had paid her a fair wage even when he struggled, the reason he protected her reputation. One afternoon, Grace brought Samuel out to the corral, where Jack was training a young horse. She wanted to show Jack that Samuel had started tracking movements with his eyes. Jack stopped working and walked over to the fence. He held out a finger to Samuel, and the baby grabbed it, gripping tightly. "You're a strong little thing, aren't you, son?" Jack murmured, his voice soft in a way Grace had never heard. Grace smiled, a genuine luminous smile that reached her eyes, the first full, natural smile she had shown since leaving the trail. "He has your grip, Mr. Avery." Jack looked up from the baby to Grace. He saw the smile, and it hit him with the force of an unexpected prairie wind. It was more than pretty. It was a sign of the life she had brought back into his dead house. He swallowed hard and quickly looked away, returning his focus to the horse. He felt a sudden, profound shift in the way he viewed her. He didn't just need her, he was beginning to value her. The emotional tone of the hollow was changing. It was no longer a place of survival. It was slowly becoming a place of gentle healing and tentative peace. But the pressure was mounting. The town gossip was turning into outright condemnation, and the local moralist, Reverend Pike, was preparing to ride out to the hollow himself to enforce the Lord's and the community's propriety. Their arrangement, born of necessity, could not continue without consequences. A choice was imminent. Grace and Jack were standing at the edge of a new precipice. Duty was turning into affection, and necessity was about to demand compromise. Chapter 3. The Duty of a Name. The quiet peace that had settled over the hollow was a fragile thing, constantly threatened by the vast, moralizing presence of Ash Hollow 8 miles away. The gossip was no longer whispered. It was declared, often from the pulpit, carried on the winds of righteous indignation. Grace felt the weight of it every time Jack returned from town, his shoulders tense, his face drawn tighter than usual. The catalyst arrived on a crisp, late autumn morning. Reverend Pike and Sheriff Cooper rode out to the ranch. They arrived with the solemn, unavoidable air of official business, tying their horses to the hitching post and walking straight to the porch. Grace was in the kitchen, kneading dough for the day's bread, Samuel tucked into his cradle near the warmth of the stove. Jack met them outside, immediately squaring his shoulders. "Gentlemen," Jack greeted them, his voice cordial but iced with reserve. "Mr. Avery," the Reverend Pike began, his voice a low, sonorous blend of piety and thinly veiled self-importance. "We've come on a matter of conscience, and more importantly, a matter of community standing." Sheriff Cooper, a fair man, stood slightly back, his expression guarded. "Jack, it's about Mrs. Mallory. People are talking. The Avery name is an old, respected one in this county, and the presence of a lone, unrelated woman residing permanently under your roof is creating scandal. It's improper, for her sake, and for the boys." Reverend Pike stepped forward, his eyes narrowed on the ranch house door. "It is a temptation, Mr. Avery. For both of you. A sinful arrangement that soils the good name of the late Mrs. Avery, and sends the wrong message to our young women. Ash Hollow requires order, and that requires adherence to decency." Jack stood his ground, his frustration boiling beneath a practiced layer of control. "Mrs. Mallory is here as a nurse for my son Reverend, and a housekeeper. Her work has been exemplary, and her virtue is unquestioned." "Unquestioned in your eyes, perhaps?" Pike countered, a sneer flashing across his face. "But the town has seen the results. The boy is thriving. The house looks softened. It's not just the wet nursing, Jack. It's the domesticity. You are living as man and wife, without the sanctity of the vows." Grace, listening from the kitchen doorway, felt the air thick with condemnation. Her throat tightened. She hated the way the Reverend made her quiet efforts sound like a vice. She knew what they were implicitly threatening: Jack's standing, and potentially, her removal from the one place she felt safe. Jack clenched his fists. "And what do you propose, Reverend? That I send the only woman who can care for Samuel out into the territory to starve?" Pike smiled, a thin, chilling expression. "No. I propose you cease the temptation. You have two options, Mr. Avery. Either you dismiss Mrs. Mallory, or you make the arrangement legal." The ultimatum hung heavy in the air. Pike then turned and, with a brief, cold blessing, rode away with the sheriff, leaving Jack standing alone on his porch, defeated. Jack stood on the porch for a long time, staring out at his fields. He was a man of action, but here he was, blocked by the unseen, powerful forces of gossip and duty. Grace finally stepped out. Standing a respectful distance away, she was holding Samuel, who was now awake and fussy. "Mr. Avery," she began softly. "I heard. I am sorry they put this on you. I told you I would leave. It would be easier." Jack finally turned, the conflict warring in his tired eyes. He looked at her, then at the healthy, warm baby in her arms. "No, Grace. It would not be easier. For Samuel, it would be a disaster. He needs you. And for me." He trailed off, unable to voice the sudden, frightening realization that her quiet presence was now the foundation of his home. He walked over to her, his large frame looming, not in threat, but in utter exhaustion. "The Reverend is right about one thing," Jack stated, his voice flat, professional. "The arrangement must stop looking improper. My son needs a legal mother, and you need a home and a name that will be respected. The Avery name will protect you." He looked directly into her eyes, bypassing her timidity and appealing to her sense of duty, the one thing she held dear. "Grace Mallory, I am asking you to marry me, not for love, but for duty, and for Samuel." Grace gasped, reeling back as if struck. The proposal was stripped bare, a practical contract laid out in the harsh frontier light. It lacked passion, but it was heavy with necessity. "Marriage," she repeated, the word tasting like dust and iron. "I can't, not without. I was married, Mr. Avery. I know what that means. I won't trade one duty for another without a single choice." "You will have choice," Jack insisted, holding her gaze. "This will be a marriage of rooms, Grace. A partnership, not an ownership. You will be my wife in name, respected in town, but I will not touch you, nor will I presume upon your grief or your person. You will have security, and I will have my son's well-being secured. We will share a name, a table, and the care of the child. Nothing more, unless you choose it." Grace searched his face, seeing the honesty and the deep, honorable commitment in his eyes. This was not Eli. This was a man offering her respect and a shield. It was the only way to keep the peace and remain with the child she had saved. "I accept, Mr. Avery," Grace whispered, her resistance collapsing into necessity. For Samuel," Jack confirmed, sealing the pact with a nod. The wedding was a small, somber affair conducted by Reverend Pike in the cold, drafty church. It was witnessed by Sheriff Cooper and Mrs. Hanlon, whose kind smile was Grace's only comfort. The town watched with a mixture of satisfaction and continued skepticism. The Reverend, though pleased with the outcome, made sure to emphasize the solemn nature of the vows, warning them to conduct themselves with the utmost sobriety. Back at the Hollow, they moved Grace's simple cot into the second bedroom. That night, their first as husband and wife, was the loneliest and strangest of Grace's life. She lay awake, listening to the vast silence of the prairie and the muted sounds of Jack moving in the main bedroom down the hall. She was legally a wife again, yet she was safer and freer than she had ever been. The ensuing weeks settled into a delicate, fragile rhythm. They were husband and wife to the world, but simply Grace and Jack within the walls of their home, partners in a shared, profound mission. Yet the formality of the marriage, the shared name, the shared table, began to amplify the restrained affection that had been growing between them. They would eat supper together in the lamplight, not speaking of feelings, but of the ranch, the crops, and Samuel's latest developmental milestone. They were building a life, word by word, deed by deed. Jack began to rely on her quiet counsel. He'd ask her opinion on the winter stores or the branding schedule. Grace, in turn, began to shed the last vestiges of her timidity, laughing easily when Samuel blew a raspberry or Jack told a rare, dry joke. The sexual tension was a subtle, constant current beneath the surface of their propriety. One cold night, Jack returned from checking the barn, shivering. Grace was sitting by the hearth, mending, the lamplight illuminating the delicate curve of her neck and the simple elegance of her braid. "You should take a toddy, Jack," Grace said, using his first name with an ease that still surprised them both. "You're chilled to the bone." He stood beside the hearth, letting the heat sink into his coat, watching her quick, precise movements with the needle. She was wearing a simple, high-necked dress, but the concentration on her face, the way her lower lip tucked in, was intensely attractive. Jack felt a sharp, unexpected surge of desire. It was more than lust. It was a deep, physical yearning for comfort and connection, a desire born of profound emotional need. He wanted to reach out and smooth the hair from her temple, to see what that reserved expression would look like when softened by intimacy. He swallowed hard, turning back to the fire. "I'm fine, Grace. Just tired." "You look tired," Grace replied, genuinely concerned. She stood, and for the first time, she closed the distance between them, reaching out to touch his arm. Her fingers were rough from the lye and the scrubbing brush, but the warmth of her hand was a startling, intimate shock against the wool of his coat. "You take too much on, Jack," she murmured, her voice laced with concern. "You carry the weight of everything. Your wife, the boy, the ranch, now the town. You don't have to carry me too." He looked down at her, the scent of fresh soap and warm skin suddenly intoxicating. Her eyes, usually haunted by the past, were clear, warm, and utterly present. He saw the gentle invitation in her touch, not of sex, but of partnership and shared burden. He slowly reached up and covered her hand with his own. His rough, calloused palm enveloped her small, hard-working hand. This physical contact, so chaste and yet so potent, felt more intimate than any hurried, angry touch Eli had ever inflicted. It was a connection built on trust, not ownership. He leaned his head down, just inches from her own, his voice a low rumble. "You are not a weight, Grace. You are the only thing that brought order back to this hollow place." He held her gaze for another beat, letting the longing hang palpably between them. It was a clear, electric silence that spoke of all the vows they had not taken, and all the walls they were attempting to climb. Grace felt her heart hammer against her ribs, the shame of her past marriage battling with the undeniable tender pull toward this honorable, distant man. Then, with a painful effort of will, Jack let go of her hand, stepping back. He walked to the hallway, his face once again a mask of strained duty. "Good night, Grace," he said, his voice husky. "Good night, Jack," she replied, her voice shaky. They both retreated to their separate rooms, closing their respective doors. But the touch, the brief electric press of their hands, lingered. They were married on paper, but in that moment by the fire, they had acknowledged the truth. Their duty had given birth to a dangerous, beautiful desire. The marriage of rooms was failing. The heart was starting to demand the whole house. The quiet affection was growing into something undeniable, ready to break the bounds of their pragmatic agreement. Chapter 4. The Breaking of the Wall. The marriage of rooms, a contract drawn on duty and sealed by necessity, was slowly dissolving under the weight of shared life. Winter had wrapped the hollow in a blanket of crystalline frost, forcing Grace and Jack closer to the central hearth, and the enforced proximity was breeding an intimacy neither had intended. Samuel, now 5 months old, was the primary architect of this demolition. His cooing laughter, and his need for 2 attentive parents, meant that Grace and Jack were constantly in motion around each other, their bodies brushing past in the narrow kitchen, their voices overlapping in the warm, dimly lit nursery. The boundaries they had so strictly drawn, the separate bedrooms, the formal address, the professional distance, were crumbling like old mortar. Grace particularly found her vigilance failing. She had spent a lifetime braced for the next blow, the next angry command. With Eli, touch had been either a bruising assertion of ownership or a calculated demand. Her father's hands, when they weren't wrapped around a bottle, were heavy and rough. Her body had learned to recoil, to anticipate pain, leaving her emotionally starved and physically distrustful of all men. Yet Jack Avery was a devastating contradiction. His hands, though calloused by ranch work, were deliberate, respectful, and impossibly gentle when handling Samuel. Grace would often watch him feed the baby a thin broth, his large thumb resting near the infant's jaw, moving with a patience that astonished her. He was a silent sentinel, a presence that promised safety, not threat. This quiet competence was the true danger. It eroded the walls of distress and reluctance she had built against men. The eruption of longing, the evening chores became the most treacherous time. One night, a fierce blizzard howled outside, rattling the windows and making the fire the only true refuge. Jack was struggling with a stubborn buckle on his saddle rigging, which he was mending by the firelight. Grace was preparing the final nursing before bed. She sat in the old rocker, Samuel, a weight of warm contentment in her arms. The fire cast a rich, flickering light, painting the room in deep, sensual shadows. The air was thick with the scent of wood smoke, old leather, and warm milk. Grace finished feeding Samuel, and gently pulled the collar of her nightgown back up, the worn flannel soft against her skin. She held the baby against her shoulder, patting him lightly until a small burp escaped. She leaned her head back, momentarily lost in the simple peace. Jack had finished mending the saddle. He rose and walked across the room to take the sleeping baby from her. This had become a ritual, the handover of the greatest treasure. As he reached for Samuel, his large, solid presence enveloped her. His coat smelled of cold air and wool, a clean, sharp scent that made her inhale deeply. Their hands, Grace's small and smooth, Jack's large and ridged with work, met on the baby's back. In that fleeting moment, Grace looked up, finding her gaze trapped by his. The proximity was overwhelming. Jack's eyes, usually guarded and fixed on the horizon, were dark, deep, and focused entirely on her. There was a banked fire in their depths, not of anger or desire to possess, but a yearning so raw and exposed it mirrored the ache in her own chest. It was not Samuel's weight between them now, it was the electric acknowledgement of their own bodies, two lonely adults married in name, now craving the comfort of reality. Grace felt a dizzying mix of emotions, a sweet, melting weakness she had never known, followed instantly by a cold, reflexive dread. This was how it started. The closeness. The warmth. The permission. And then the demand. Jack felt her fear. He saw the sudden widening of her pupils, the subtle tremor that ran through her hand where it touched his. He knew he had trespassed, however accidentally, on the fragile ground of her trust. He pulled Samuel slowly away, breaking the physical contact with agonizing restraint. He held the baby close, but his gaze never left Grace's face, communicating a silent question, an apology and a promise. "You should sleep, Grace," he murmured, his voice husky, betraying the control he was exerting. "It's late." Grace could only nod, mute, her heart hammering a frantic warning against her ribs. She watched him walk away, his back a rigid, protective wall, and knew that the wall between their rooms, and the one inside her heart, was on the verge of collapse. The sensual pull was undeniable, but the fear of what intimacy truly meant was paralyzing. The nightmare and the truth, the increasing domestic warmth acted as a catalyst, pulling Grace's trauma to the surface. She was no longer just surviving, she was healing, and healing required confronting the source of her pain. A few nights later, the darkness outside the ranch was absolute, the silence broken only by the crackle of the embers in the stove. Grace fell into a deep, troubled sleep, and the past, always a restless ghost, became a terrifying reality. She was back on the dusty floor of her father's cabin. The air was sour with cheap whiskey and fear. The memory was fragmented, but the feeling was whole. The smell of her father's sweat, the heavy thud of his steps, the sound of glass breaking. Then, the scene shifted, blending seamlessly with the worst moments of her married life. She saw Eli, his face twisted in resentment, his hand tight around her wrist, pulling her toward the dark corner of the wagon. "You're mine, Grace. You owe me a quiet house and a smile. And you'll give it to me, or I'll take it." The physical fear of forced, loveless touch overwhelmed her. She felt the weight of ownership, the violation of self, the crushing knowledge that her body was merely a tool to serve a man's comfort and ego. She woke with a choked, panicked scream tearing from her throat. Her body was drenched in a cold sweat, her hands clawing at the blankets, trying to push away the ghosts of rough hands and cold words. Before she could fully grasp where she was, the door to her room burst open. Jack was there, a shadow in the doorway, a rifle instinctively held low in his hand. He took in the scene. Grace huddled, terrified, her breathing shallow and ragged, and dropped the rifle. He rushed to her side, but stopped short of touching her. He knelt by the cot, his face etched with alarm. "Grace! What is it? What happened? Are you hurt?" He looked at her, truly seeing the raw, desperate terror in her eyes. This was not the fear of a fire or a wild animal. This was the fear of him, the fear of men. Grace flinched away, pulling the blanket up to her chin, her eyes darting between Jack's presence and the safety of the wall. "Go," she gasped, her voice barely audible. "Please, go. I'm fine." It was just a dream, but Jack refused. He saw the absolute, fragile disintegration of the capable, resilient woman he had married for convenience. He saw the residue of a deeper, long-held pain. He sat back on his heels, placing his hands on his knees in a gesture of absolute non-aggression. He simply waited, his large frame a promise of stillness and safety. "I won't leave," Jack said quietly, letting his eyes meet hers. "But I won't touch you either, Grace, not until you tell me to. I saw your face. You're not fine. Tell me what I need to know to stand guard for you." His willingness to stand guard rather than demand information was the final, devastating crack in her defenses. Jack Avery didn't want to possess her pain. He wanted to protect it. Confession and redefinition. Grace slowly lowered the blanket, taking a shuddering breath. The fire in her heart, the fear of exposure, was finally eclipsed by the desperate, cathartic need to be known. She began to speak, her voice thin and broken, but gaining strength as the truth spilled out into the silent waiting room. "My father, he was a heavy drinker. I was raised knowing that a woman's body belonged to the man who provided the roof. He was rough, always angry." She paused, the memory sharp and cold. Eli was different. He didn't drink, but he was controlling and cruel. He married me to have an orderly house and a woman who couldn't fight back. He used my fear as a leash. He taught me that intimacy was ownership, and that my worth was measured only by my silence. Grace covered her face with her hands, the shame of the admission burning her. "The hardest part, Jack, the worst sin, is that when the fever took them both, my husband and my son, I felt a moment of pure, blinding relief. Relief that the heavy hand was finally gone. How can I possibly deserve this peace? How can I look at you, a good, honorable man, and not wait for the moment you decide I'm yours to command? I carry the guilt of being free, and the terror that every man is Eli in waiting." Jack listened, his face pale and grim. He understood now the quiet timidity, the flinches, the guardedness that had defined her since the day they met. He understood that the woman he loved had survived a battlefield. He slowly moved closer, still not touching, and spoke with a low, fierce intensity she had never heard. "Grace," he said, his voice absolute. "Look at me." When she lifted her terrified eyes, he met them with an unwavering depth of feeling. "Eli Carter owned a woman, Grace. I am offering my hand to a partner. He controlled you with fear. I want to build a life with you on trust. I swore an oath to my late wife, but that loyalty is not a chain. I realize tonight, listening to you scream, that I have loved you since the day you stood over Samuel's cradle and fought for his life with all the courage you had left." He shifted his weight, resting his forehead momentarily on the edge of her cot. "I love you for your resilience. I love you because you brought the quiet back to my house, and the life back to my boy. I love you because you are the only home I have ever known." He lifted his head, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "I am not asking you to forget Eli. I am asking you to let me stand guard against his ghost. I want this marriage to be redemptive for you, Grace. I want you to know that the touch of a man can be shelter, not a sentence." He reached out his hand, palm up, resting it flat on the blanket beside her. It was a clear, unambiguous invitation. An offering, not a taking. "I want to be your husband, Grace. By choice, but only if you tell me to move." Grace stared at his hand, so large, so rough, so absolutely still. It was the hand of a protector, a partner, a man who had admitted his own profound vulnerability. The terror receded, replaced by a yearning so deep it felt like the marrow of her bones. She placed her small, trembling hand into his. Redemptive union. The touch was a silent promise. Jack gently closed his fingers around hers, his grip firm yet tender. He didn't pull her toward him. He simply stood as a shield against the dark room and the demons of her past. He slowly sat on the edge of the cot, his weight settling the mattress, his presence immediately grounding her. "The rooms are done, Grace," he whispered, his eyes never leaving hers. "I cannot sleep alone in mine, knowing you are terrified in yours." Grace felt the last sliver of her torn reluctance finally give way. She had been afraid of men, but she realized she was afraid of losing him, losing the kindness, the protection, the profound, quiet safety he represented. "Don't leave me alone, Jack," she whispered, the words a raw plea. "Not tonight. Just stay." He understood. He stood and quietly went to his room, returning moments later with his pillow and the thick sheepskin blanket from his bed. He blew out the lamp in the hallway, plunging the room into darkness, lit only by the faint light filtering from the window. He settled himself, not on the cot beside her, but on the floor, leaning his back against the wall, the heavy blanket pulled up to his shoulders. He was guarding the door, guarding the room, guarding her. "I'm here, Grace," he said simply. Grace lay there, watching his silhouette, her heart beating a slow, steady rhythm for the first time in years. The shame of the past, the guilt of the relief, all of it felt distant, muted by the powerful, tangible presence of an honorable man who had chosen to sleep on the cold floor to protect her peace. She shifted, sliding down beneath the blankets, and found his gaze in the darkness. "Jack," she murmured. "Yes, Grace? Come up here. You'll freeze. You don't have to touch me. But please, don't sleep on the floor." Jack hesitated, understanding the immense leap of trust she was offering. He rose quietly, walked to the cot, and lifted the sheepskin blanket. He slid carefully onto the edge of the narrow mattress, his back turned to her, a respectful, almost painful distance maintained between their bodies. He was a mountain of warmth beside her, but he was as separate as if a chasm lay between them. "I won't cross the line, Grace," he promised, his voice low and firm. Grace reached out her hand in the darkness and found the warm flannel of his shirt. Her touch was hesitant, but determined. She moved her hand, not demanding, but simply seeking contact, settling it flat on the solid, protective width of his back. "The line is gone, Jack," she whispered. "I love you. You're the only man who has ever taught me what that word means." Jack felt the impact of her words, the confession she had been fighting for months, strike him deep in his soul. He turned slowly, carefully, until he was facing her. He reached out and gently brushed a stray lock of hair from her damp forehead, his touch as light as a feather. "You're home, Grace," he whispered, leaning down. He did not kiss her fiercely or demandingly. The kiss was tender, slow, and redemptive, a promise of safety and a profound, shared release of loneliness. He paused, asking for consent with every breath he took. He didn't rush. He lingered, letting her lead letting her know that her agency, her choice, was paramount. As they finally came together, it was not the rushed, angry possession of her past, but a quiet, breathtaking act of healing and partnership. It was a shared vulnerability, where every gentle stroke was a reassurance, every kiss a balm against the years of fear. In Jack's arms, under the quiet guard of the winter night, Grace Mallory finally learned that love, the truest kind, was built not on ownership, but on shelter. She fell asleep that night, curled against his side, not out of duty, but out of a profound and overwhelming sense of peace. The guilt was gone, replaced by the weight of a life, found anew, in the arms of an honorable man. Chapter 5. The Harvest and the Home. Revised. The winter that followed their quiet, redemptive union was the truest winter of their lives, a season not of hardship, but of profound internal growth. The cold outside pressed against the walls of the hollow, but inside, a new, vibrant life was blossoming. The marriage of rooms was officially over. Grace and Jack shared the master bedroom, which had become the warmest, safest room in the territory. The small cot in the adjacent room remained, but it was now only a storage place for blankets, a silent monument to the distance they had overcome. Grace's transformation was startling, both to Jack and to herself. The timid woman who arrived at Ash Hollow, hunched under the weight of grief and abuse, was gone. In her place was Grace Avery, a confident partner whose voice, while still soft, carried the unmistakable ring of authority. Her strength was no longer the desperate, necessary resilience of survival, but the quiet, assured competence of a woman who knew her worth. She taught Jack how to run the household finances with a careful, meticulous hand, ensuring that every dollar was stretched and saved. Jack, in turn, finished teaching her to read. They spent cold evenings by the fire, Grace tracing the letters of the newspaper, her brow furrowed in concentration. The act of sharing knowledge, of creating a partnership built on mutual respect, was as deep and profound as any physical intimacy. The fading of the ghosts and the sharing of peace, the ghosts of Grace's past began to shrink, starved of the fear they needed to thrive. She still had nightmares, but they were rare now, and they no longer left her paralyzed. She would simply wake, find the solid, warm presence of Jack beside her, and turn toward him. Jack never questioned, never demanded details. He simply held her, his strong arms a clear, undeniable promise of safety. One morning, months after their first true night together, Grace looked at Jack across the breakfast table, sunlight streaming through the kitchen window, and realized he looked younger. The deep lines of perpetual guilt and exhaustion around his eyes had softened. His smile, though still rare, reached his eyes now, warm and genuine. Jack had wrestled for years with the profound guilt over his late wife's death in childbirth. He had convinced himself that his inability to save her meant he was fundamentally inadequate, undeserving of happiness. Grace, with her quiet tenderness and unwavering faith in his goodness, had systematically dismantled that belief. "You're thinking again," Grace observed, stirring a ladle into the porridge for Samuel. Jack set down his coffee cup. "I was thinking of Sarah," he admitted, referring to his late wife. He no longer felt the need to hide the thought. Grace didn't flinch. She simply nodded. I think of Thomas every day. I think of the journey and the graves. It used to feel like a betrayal, allowing myself to be happy here, Jack confessed, his eyes momentarily distant, like I was dishonoring her memory by letting someone else bring light back into her house. Grace walked to his side, resting a hand on his shoulder. She loved you, Jack, and no love, if it was true, would ever want you to live in shadow. She would want her son raised by a mother who loves him and a father who smiles. The life we build here doesn't erase the past. It honors the future she never had. That was the key. Grace Avery had found the spiritual justification for their life together, transforming his guilt into a sense of continuation and purpose. Jack finally felt the heavy chain of his own making fall away. His life had begun anew, not despite his loss, but built carefully from it. Domestic authority and unquestioned trust. As Samuel grew, reaching his first birthday in the gentle warmth of late spring, Mrs. Avery's role solidified from wet nurse and partner to mother and lady of the ranch. She began to take charge of the ranch's correspondence, her neat, newly learned script filling out forms and managing supply orders. She was not only the heart of the hollow, she was its intelligent, administrative backbone. The official documents that arrived now carried the name Avery Ranch, managed by Jack and Grace. One day, Jack had to ride into town to meet with a land agent. He paused before leaving, handing Grace a heavy leather pouch of bills. Keep this in the strongbox, Grace. We'll need it for the seed purchase next month. Grace Avery took the pouch. She was surprised not by the money, but by the casual, absolute trust he placed in her. Eli would never have let her touch a single coin he considered his. I'll manage it, she confirmed, meeting his eyes. He paused, then smiled, a small, proud curve of his lips. I know you will. You manage everything else. He kissed her then, a slow, lingering kiss that was no longer an exploration of a fragile boundary, but a secure affirmation of their bond. It happened in the middle of the kitchen, in broad daylight, a simple, established intimacy that required no explanation. Grace watched him right away, a confident, handsome man astride a strong horse, and knew that the power of this new life lay in the partnership. She was not a possession. She was the co-owner of everything he was and everything they had built. The final test of community and true acceptance. The true test of their transformation came not on the ranch, but back in Ash Hollow. Their marriage of convenience had stopped the town's immediate criticism, but true acceptance required proof that their arrangement was consecrated by love and decency, not just duty. Sheriff Cooper, who had always maintained a respectful watchfulness, visited one Sunday, ostensibly to discuss cattle trails. But he lingered, drinking Mrs. Avery's coffee, watching the dynamics of the family. Jack and Grace were a seamless unit. When Jack spoke of the ranch's plans, Grace would interject details about the supplies or the expected yield, and Jack would listen, nodding, treating her commentary with the respect of a foreman. When Samuel toddled, Grace would scoop him up, but often, Jack would reach out a hand, steadying them both. They moved around each other with a silent, established language of affection and shared labor. Sheriff Cooper finally set down his empty mug. Jack, Mrs. Avery, he said, his eyes twinkling. The town, Reverend Pike included, is satisfied. You've done right by the boy. More than right. You've got a proper home here. It's a good home, Sheriff, Jack said, resting his hand on the back of Grace's chair. Grace smiled, her own deep contentment radiating outward. It is a true home, Sheriff, built on better ground than I ever thought possible. The final, official seal of their acceptance was delivered by Nettie Avery, Jack's sharp-tongued sister-in-law, who had been the most vocal critic of the wet nurse arrangement. Nettie, a woman who valued only blood and tradition, arrived unannounced one afternoon. She immediately critiqued Mrs. Avery's new curtains, her preserve-making methods, and the quality of the dust on the parlor floor. Grace met her barbs with quiet, patient good humor, simply offering Nettie a fresh cup of coffee and a slice of her celebrated apple pie. She didn't fight. She simply existed as a confident, immovable fixture of the Avery Ranch. Then, Samuel, now walking with clumsy, joyful steps, stumbled and cried. Grace swooped him up, soothing him with soft words, examining his knee with tender concern. Nettie watched, her sharp expression slowly dissolving into something wounded and yearning. She had been unable to conceive, and the sight of this thriving love child, her nephew, in Grace's devoted embrace was the final surrender. When Grace turned to offer the child to her, Nettie hesitantly took him. The baby immediately wrapped a small hand around her finger. He's a good boy, Nettie, Grace said simply. He has a strong heart. Nettie clutched the baby tightly. You've done right by him, Grace, she conceded, her voice raw. It was the highest praise she could give. He's a true Avery. And you're his mother. The approval of the community no longer mattered to Grace. She had Jack and Samuel. But Nettie's acceptance was the final, official welcoming into the life she had earned. The closing scene, the harvest festival. It was late autumn again, a year and a half after Grace had walked into Ash Hollow with nothing but dust and grief. The town was celebrating a bountiful harvest, a time of genuine community and gratitude. Jack and Grace drove into town together in the large spring wagon, Samuel nestled securely between them. Grace was wearing a new dress, a cheerful blue muslin that Mrs. Hanlon had helped her sew. She didn't wear black anymore. The town square was bustling with people, music, and the smell of roasting meat. Reverend Pike smiled and nodded cordially. Sheriff Cooper tipped his hat respectfully. Even the women who had whispered about her a year ago offered warm greetings. Grace stood near the large laden trestle table, holding Samuel, a sturdy, laughing toddler now, on her hip. Her hand rested naturally against his back, her gaze sweeping the crowd, searching for Jack. He was across the square, talking to a fellow rancher, his face animated in discussion. He looked up, his eyes immediately finding hers through the crowd. Jack paused his conversation, his expression softening into the intimate, shared look they reserved only for each other. It was a look of deep, abiding love, partnership, and gratitude. He lifted his hand in a silent salute, not a possessive wave, but a simple, enduring acknowledgement. Grace smiled back, her heart swelling until it felt too large for her chest. She watched him, her gaze traveling over the square, the life, the light, the vibrant chaos. She thought of the harsh, sun-bleached day she had arrived, utterly hollowed out. She thought of the hasty, dusty graves she had left behind, the crushing fear of her first marriage, the agonizing grief of her first son. But out of that despair, out of the duty-bound contract, she had found something real, something rooted. She had found a man who knew how to guard and how to love. She was no longer running from the past, she was building a future. She tightened her arms around Samuel, who immediately nestled his head against her shoulder, murmuring a satisfied sound. She was Grace Avery, wife, mother, partner, and woman of worth. Out here, she thought, watching Jack laugh, the sound clear and honest across the square, where everything was built from loss and dust, I had found the one thing that could grow in any soil, in the quietest, deepest way, a love that was shelter, not a chain. And so, we leave Grace and Jack Avery on the dust-settled plains, finding their lasting home not in the land but in the shelter of their own hearts. Their story reminds us that even when life strips you down to ash, resilience and love can quietly bloom in the driest soil. If you were moved by Grace's journey from grief and fear to finding redemptive partnership, hit that like button and tell us in the comments, which character's transformation was your favorite? If you're looking for more stories of unbreakable women on the frontier, don't go anywhere. We have another tale of survival and unexpected romance ready for you. Click on any of the videos now showing on your screen. Subscribe so you don't miss our next chapter of historical, sci-fi, and fantasy romance.